Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. We'll just join shortly. Thank you for your patience. We had some technical difficulties, but we'll just start in a few minutes. Sister, can you have the slides up, please? And we'll begin. A very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today. It is my pleasure to invite you to the peer learning session on emission reduction assessment tool, lessons from Mongolia. So we will have the agenda for today is we will have the team from the Trade and Development Bank Mongolia share their lessons in developing the emission tool that was it's been in the running for over a year, and we would really like to thank also the Ministry of Environment and Tourism of the government of Mongolia, who had commissioned this work and who have been instrumental in supporting us to get associated with the Trade and Development Bank and the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association to conduct this work. Then we would move forward with Mr. Ajit Patbiri, who will be sharing with us the workings of the emission reduction tool, followed by which we will have an open discussion where we would most welcome to have your questions and queries on the tool. So a few housekeeping rules before we begin. Most of the participants will be on mute mode while we have the presentations. However, you can put in your questions into the Q&A box for the speakers during the course of the session. If you would like to ask the question directly to the speakers, you may raise your hand and we can connect you during the open discussion. Before we begin, a bit about the Asia-Let's Partnership. So the Asia-Let's Partnership was launched in 2012 as a voluntary regional network that promotes and enables low-emission climate resilient development and supports countries with upgrading their NDCs and their low-emission development strategies as well. It is hosted by GIZ currently within the SPA project of the BMU, which is the government of Germany. ALP currently has 112 and 1,073 organizations and individuals who are part of this. And we are happy to have also 65 government agencies from 14 Asian countries who join us during these sessions. We would most likely like to welcome you all for these sessions and ask you to join us through the link which we will share with you post the session, where you can participate on all the webinars and all the sessions that we conduct in the future. The COPs, that the communities of practice that we have within the Asia-Leds partnership, comprise of the Grid Renewable Energy Community of Practice, which largely focuses on distributed energy resources and resilient energy systems and economic recovery. We have the NDC Finance Community of Practice, which focuses on blended capital and green bonds. We also have the Clean Mobility Community of Practice, focusing on electric mobility, and the Subnational Integration Community of Practice, which focuses on issues and opportunities in effectively integrating multi-level climate governance for achieving the NDCs. For all of these, all our participants are welcome to join, and we will share the links with you in this presentation post the webinar, and we would be grateful to have you on board for these COPs. I would now like to invite the green financing team of the Trade and Development Bank of Mongolia to share their lessons and experiences in developing this tool. And I would also like them to introduce themselves as they present today. Thank you so much, and over to you at the bank.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pratibha. And so today we're joining three of us, relationship managers of the Green Funding Office of Trade Development Bank. To begin with, let me first introduce our green funding team. Here are Ms. Urin Toya, Arun Hussain, and myself, Ms. Anon. Also, there is another relationship manager, but unfortunately, she's not able to join us currently, Ms. Maratma, and our head of green funding office, Ms. Nyamsuren. So, first of all, thank you very much, colleagues from ALP as well as from Softball, for the opportunity that you gave us to be joined in this project. The project is very of much importance for not only for the bank separately, but also for the country at the national level, because it is actually the first ever project that have been implemented in Mongolia in this area. So there were no such emission reduction tool before. So to begin with, let me first introduce the operations of our bank into this in the field of sustainability. Where by 2050 we're aiming to be a net zero bank, that meaning that we'll reach zero carbon emissions in our internal as well as in lending activities. And by 2030 we're aiming to contribute $2 billion in sustainable development overall. By 2025, we're aiming to introduce the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, TCFD system, in our operations. And so as you can see, we're having very ambitious goals towards sustainability, and in order to implement all those strategies and goals into forward sustainability, now we're currently laying the core foundation for reaching those goals. That is, since March, so in March 2020, we became an accredited entity awarded by the Green Climate Fund, and since that, since September 2020, our Green Funding Office was first established. And since then, we've been very actively working on various activities, on various works in order to implement our long-term strategies. Within this work, in April 2021, we first launched ever in the country our sustainability framework, which recognizes, controls, and monitors our green loan projects. as well as current since 2020. First, we've been working on the development of GCF, our first GCF concept node called Climate 30 Plus Green Recovery Program. So we're planning to launch this program for our corporate as well as SME clients in late 2022 or early 2023. So, and additionally, apart from aiming to implement all the 17 SDG goals into our banking operations, we're prioritizing the following four United Nations SDG goals that are equality, education, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, as well as climate action. And within the implementation of various activities in order to reach this the SDG 13 climate action, we've been very excited to be called by the the Minister of Environment of Mongolia, to join the development project of ERT tool in late 2020. So that was actually within the country's green development policy, and within this policy, the country has committed to reducing greenhouse emissions by around 23%, and to support our activities, to support our green business loan program. The MED first called us Sustainable Finance Association, and thank you very much for that also to our ALP colleagues, together softball colleagues, because they helped us to develop this Excel-based tool, which allows us for easy tracking of the project baselines, as well as assess our green project emission reductions within our green loan program.
Moreover, since 2013, Mongolian banks were working really ambitiously to establish the investment criteria for green loan projects. And in 2019, we were able to develop our Mongolian green taxonomy document. And based on that, TTBM also launched its own sustainability framework, which we've obtained a second-party opinion from TGO Iris, confirming its alignment to International Capital Market Association of Green Bond Principles and other things. Our sustainability framework includes 7 criteria. It's shown on the slide as well. They are renewable energy, low pollution energy, energy efficiency, green buildings, sustainable water and waste use and treatment, sustainable agriculture, land use, forestry and biodiversity conservation, and clean transport. Based on this document, we launched our own green business loan program back in late 2021. The conditions of our loan is shown in the table below. The only requirements we have is that the green projects and activities to be financed through this program should be met one of the criteria or sectors that I just shown of TBM sustainability framework. As our Ms. Anand mentioned before, we use our ER tool to assess our green loan program. And so far, we've been able to, the expected result from our green business loan program using the ER tool was that in total, approximately 38 million of kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced annually. And we came up with this numbers thanks to the ER tool as well. So now our colleague, Ms. Ariane Kuslin, will go over the case study that we have prepared for you.
So thanks to the ALP and softball team, we have used the
ER tool in many green loan assessments. And as for the example, we chose one of our clients' case study. So the client's business activity was to supply liquefied petroleum gas gallons to customers in food, manufacturing, mining, construction, and transport sectors. And the loan disbursement was to procure the raw materials of liquefied petroleum gas. So this project was fit to our sustainability framework's green loan category, which is low pollution energy. And the category requirement was to reduce GHG emissions by at least 20% compared to the baseline. And from this slide, you can see the calculation of the GHG emission reduction. We took relevant data from our client, which includes equivalent disbursement amount of grid electricity energy to liquefied petroleum gas, and also annual supply amount of liquefied petroleum gas. So on the next slide, you can see more detailed information of our emission reduction. So from ER2, we chose the fuel conversion sheet, and on the emission reduction threshold, we put the 20%. For this calculation, we compared the grid electricity to liquefied petroleum gas. So on the baseline data, we chose the grid electricity fuel type, and on the annual fuel consumption, we put the given data from our client, which is 3.34 million kilowatt hours, and for new fuel data, we chose the liquefied petroleum. Baseline emission of grid electricity is 2.7 billion kilogram carbon dioxide, and liquefied petroleum gases emission is 760 million kilogram carbon dioxide. So in the results, the emission was reduced by 71.5%, and based on this calculation, we concluded that this project can get our green loan.
So as we mentioned before, we use our Excel tool for everyday use, especially for green loan assessments, and therefore it has been very helpful in many ways. Also, our ALP and South Pole colleagues came up with the user guidance that also has been very helpful. And we are hoping that we could create even more tailored tool for our future use. But here are the examples of some things that we learned along the way. And the first one was that using an GHG emission reduction tool really saves us the time, and it's very cost efficient, because for some green projects, we need certain auditors to come in and do the assessment for us, which takes a lot of time, and it's very costly in some cases. And second of all, we've learned that it's a case-by-case learning process to use an ER tool, because as I've mentioned before, sustainable finance field is a relatively new field to Mongolian banking system, and TDBM was the pioneer to use this tool. But however, some of the baseline data that we've provided to South Pole was not, and the studies were very limited, especially in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the Mongolian environment. Also, some of the green projects are not very efficient to do the assessment through the tool, so it's difficult to apply for some of the cases, but there are very few. So overall, it was very helpful experience for us, and we are hoping to collaborate with our colleagues, ALP and South Pole colleagues, in the future. And if you happen to have any specific questions that we just about maybe our case study or other things, please feel free to ask us. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. That was a brilliant presentation. It was intriguing to see the client's presentation, where there's a 71% reduction that you were able to assess through the ER tool. I think we'll have many more questions coming in as the participants try and take in what you have just said. But while the questions come in, I would like to move on to the South Pole team, who will now present and share the workings of the tool and how to go about it. So I would like to now welcome the team from South Pole, which comprises of Mr. Ajit Patbari, who is a senior manager at South Pole, currently leading the environmental impact accounting services in the APAC region. We would also like to welcome Ms. Stephanie Zega, who is the managing consultant at South Pole with extensive experience in conducting GHG accounting, emission reduction strategies, and target settings for organizations, products, events in accordance with the GHG protocol. Thank you we all for joining, and over to you, Ajit.
No worries. Thank you, Pratibha. And it's nice to meet you, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Can everyone tell me if they can see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining. As Pratibha mentioned, my name is Ajit Patbari. I'm a senior manager here at South Pole, and joined with my colleague Stephanie Zega, who's based from Jakarta. I'm based out of Sydney. And here we just wanted to go through basically the ins and outs of the emission reduction assessment tool that we've created for ALP and obviously TDBM, MSFA, and other Mongolian entities as well. So it's nice to be here with you today to present on this topic. So just a bit of an agenda item. I'll first kind of go through the what the ER tool is as a whole, step through a summary of the different modules that we had created for the use by Mongolian banks in this context, as well as touch upon the scope of the tool application. I think from TDBM's presentation, they did mention that this is not a tool that you can apply to every green project, but to most green projects. But I'd like to kind of touch briefly upon there about what the scope of the application of the tool really is as well. And finally, what I'll do is I'll do a little bit more of an interactive exercise where I go through the ER tool in a bit more detail, step through the tool itself, and give you guys a little bit more of a background on how the tool actually calculates emission reductions. So this is just, again, a brief background on who's presenting today. So I, myself, Ajit Patbari, will be presenting the majority of the presentation today, but during the discussions following our presentation, Stephanie Zega will join me in helping answer any questions that you may have specifically about the ER tool. So just to step through an overview of the ER assessment tool. So basically, we were engaged by the Asia-led partnership in order to develop this emission reduction tools for low emission technologies or green projects. And the idea of this tool is it would enable financial institutions in Mongolia to more or less at a high level assess the potential emission reductions across any projects that are seeking green loans. And the idea ultimately would be allowing financial administrators in Mongolia to make more informed decisions about the provision of green loans for any particular projects or low emission technologies. So along with ALP, we work closely with the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association, or MSFA, as well as the Trade and Development Bank of Mongolia, TDBM, in seeing through the development of this ER tool and hopefully making it more applicable in the Mongolian context. And so the way that we went about developing this tool in initial discussions with MSFA and TDBM, we wanted to determine what sort of modules this particular tool will cover. So which aspects of the environment could this tool actually assess in terms of emissions reductions? And so in our interactions, we closely tried to align a lot of these modules with the Mongolian green taxonomy, as well as the ultimate goals of the Mongolian government in the 7 different areas of environmental focus. And so as you'll see through these 8 modules, stepping through them, starting with energy efficiency, this would really be focused on any projects where there's a replacement of equipment with more energy efficient versions, as well as any energy efficiency improvements to heating. Following the energy efficiency module, we have the renewable energy module, and this is really the focus of where there's investment in the generation of renewable energy on its own, or the replacement specifically of fossil fuel energy with renewable energy. So the replacement of, let's say, a coal-fired power plant with a renewable energy power plant. Following this module, the third module we look at is farming. So can we have a module that focuses on the emission reductions from the implementation of more sustainable farming practices? And this generally covers different aspects of farming, including electricity, fuel, fertilizer, pesticide, waste, and wastewater. The fourth module that we look at is a transportation module, and this is the focus on the replacement of vehicles to less carbon-intensive types, or the reduction of vehicle fuel consumption. The fifth module here is focused on the construction of buildings. And this is primarily focused on greenfield building construction projects. So it doesn't cover brownfield construction projects per se. But when we talk about greenfield building construction projects, we're talking about projects that are brand new constructions. And it covers all aspects from building materials, material transportation, as well as the energy consumed during construction as well. The sixth module we look at is the waste module. And this is the focus on the reduction of waste generation, the conversions of waste management, as well as the reducing of distance to waste disposal. The seventh module we look at is the fuel conversion module, and this is the replacement of fuel or energy resources to less carbon intensive ones, all whilst generating the same amount of energy. So really the consumption of a particular energy source per amount of energy generated. And finally, the eighth module, we're looking at water. So this is really the improvement of energy efficiency in water supply and water treatment as well. And here we have a general layout of the modules. Each of the modules has a 6-panel layout, which I'll go through when I step through the actual XLER tool in a second. Now, when we're looking at the scope of the emission reduction tool application, keeping in mind that when we created this tool, we wanted to be able to create a tool that would enable financial decision-making in the space of green loans. And what that generally means is when we work within the space of emission calculations and emission reductions, there's a certain level of assumptions and extrapolations that need to be made in order to enable effective decision-making. So decision-making that is going to be based on a science basis, but also something that doesn't have to require a significant amount of baseline data in order to actually conduct. And so when we look at what the tool does, we're looking specifically at the fact that the tool provides high-level information and inputs for the early stages of credit risk analysis or financial assessment. The tool also can assess individual emission reduction projects, and here it would be a case-by-case or ad hoc basis. And the third thing the tool can do is it provides a potential impact of emission reductions as well as energy savings as well. Now, what the tool does not do here is it doesn't undertake specific credit risk analysis or other financial assessment tasks. It can't act as a sole determining factor for green loans issuance. And the reason we say this is because many green loans can require various aspects of and various types of environmental benefits. So, for example, may not necessarily be focused only on emissions reduction. You may find that certain projects may have other co-benefits, such as development, such as water saving, such as waste reduction. So it's not always just a focus on emission reduction, and that's why this tool can't necessarily act as a sole determining factor for green loans issuance. And thirdly, what the tool does not do, it does not assess emission reductions between projects or across time. Really what this tool is a focus on is a specific project at a specific time. It could focus on the lifetime of a project, but keeping in mind that projects are always subject to change based on time, and the nuances of certain projects can also differ. And so this tool does not necessarily capture all of those nuances. Now, what I'd like to do is just do a step through of the emission reduction tool. And so this is going to just be a focus on the actual tool itself here. So the tool, as you can see, has 8 modules, all in the bottom tabs here. We start off with the introduction module, which really aims to provide a level of guidance on the methodology of how to use the tool, what sort of emission factors were integrated into the tool. There's more detail on the data sources and emission factors in a separate guidance document that we have provided to ALP, TDBM, and other stakeholders. But really what this introduction page is to provide an outlook on what the different ER modules are and what basic assumptions were integrated into the calculators for each module. So starting with the energy efficiency module, if I zoom in here, one thing I want to just first highlight is going back to the module summary page that I'd highlighted earlier in my presentation. When we were looking through the module summary, I did mention that there's a 6-panel sort of setup for every module. And so this is what we see with this module as well. So if I zoom out for a second, you'll see that each of these blue headings represents one module panel. And so you'll have project information, baseline data, and new installation data. Then the other 3 panels here are the energy efficiency panel, the baseline emissions panel, the new emissions panel. So what we're trying to display here is on the left-hand side panels, these are really where the inputs are put in. So by any of the financial administrators across any of the banks, they would input all their baseline data, the data for the new installations, as well as any specific information relevant to the project for TDB's own records would go into this particular panel here. And then the outputs are basically provided here through the 3 green panels here. So the output on what the overall energy efficiency and emission reductions are, the output on the baseline emissions, so to give financial administrators an understanding of what would a baseline scenario look like should this project not occur, and then a new emissions panel, which is indicating what are the new emissions from the replacement of equipment or heating in this case. Now, if I zoom in specifically for the energy efficiency module here, you'll note that what we typically do is under project information, we provide areas for project name, project description, the date of the project, who it was assessed by, and the emission reduction threshold for that particular green loan that needs to be issued. And we also do have a user key here to indicate which parts of the tool are open text inputs, input fields, or filled input fields, and which ones are pre-filled fields and cannot be overwritten. When we look at the baseline data panel, specifically for the energy efficiency module, we have 2 types of sub-modules, we could say, that are assessed by an energy efficiency module. So the equipment replacement sub-module, which really focuses on what is the energy efficiency for a specific type of equipment that needs to be replaced. So for example, if we were going to replace, let's say, an old heater that relies on coal, or let's say a boiler that relies on coal with an electric heater, we would put in the details of the boiler, the coal-fired boiler in here. And this would ask you questions such as, what is the energy type? Here we would more or less go through whatever coal type that the boiler uses. The annual amount of consumption. So this is to get an understanding, this would be something, these are questions that you would ask your clients in order to understand, okay, what would be a typical scenario for reducing emissions from a boiler, or what would a typical boiler consume in a year? We have other spare lines here, because what typically happens is, depending on what you choose, so let's say if I chose other bituminous coal, these different drop-downs will change depending on what type of energy type is being asked here. And then if we're saying that there's annual amounts of consumption, and I put in 3 kilograms, what you'll see is the baseline emissions automatically update in order to determine what sort of baseline emissions you would get. Now, if we look here, it says, does the baseline equipment contain any refrigerants that can be released? So this is a yes or no question. And so if I chose no, you'll note that nothing really changes here in the rows below it. However, if I choose yes, there are more details that pop down in terms of understanding what type of refrigerant has been released or leaked, the amount of refrigerant present in the equipment, as well as what percentage of annual refrigerant leakage is there. And this all has an influence on what the final emissions will look like in the baseline scenario. So if I was to say hypothetically here, we have HFC 23 as a type of refrigerant. There's 1 kilogram present in the equipment, and the amount that leaks is about 50%. You'll see here that the equipment replacement has automatically updated, and so has the baseline refrigerant refill. In some cases throughout the tool, you may not have all the numbers, and where we don't have numbers, we do our best within the building of this tool to implement default numbers or default values. So in the case that we don't have an annual refrigerant leakage, we click annual refrigerant leakage is unknown, and then we just give a detail of what type of equipment this would be. So is it a condensing unit? Is it an industrial unit? Is it a small stationary air conditioning situation? So in this case, if we're dealing with boilers, the closest thing to deal with boilers would be a heat pump. And so we have default values for heat pumps that are put in, and this provides an indication of what sort of baseline refrigerant refill we would expect. Now, if we are only, let's say this project only focuses on equipment replacement, we can do that. If it focuses on both equipment replacement and heating, then it's a matter of just entering in the heating values as well. However, for the cases of this example, let's pretend that it's just going to be equipment replacement. Now we move on to the new installation data. So the first question we're looking at is, what is the lifetime of the new equipment? And this is particularly important because obviously when we have new equipment, certain equipment lasts a lifetime, and whenever you have new equipment that's installed, the emission reductions are often going to be spread across the lifetime of that piece of equipment. So if we say that the new piece of equipment lasts 10 years, and we say that the new energy type here is going to be grid electricity. So here we've got grid electricity, and a new energy emission factor has popped up here. And if we say the annual amount of consumption, for these purposes, it's going to only be in kilowatt hours because we're requesting the energy type to be grid electricity. So annual amount of energy consumption here, I'm going to put 100. And as you can see here, it says, does the baseline equipment contain any refrigerants that can be released or leaked? So here I'm going to write no. And then what we do here is we've got the new emissions here. We've got the new energy consumption at 100, the new energy emission factor specifically for electricity at 1.68 kilograms CO2e per kilowatt hour. And this comes to a new emissions of 168.29 kilograms CO2e. Now, if I look at the energy efficiency module here, so this is really the final output from this module. And as you can see here, the energy savings are quite significant. We save 78.5 kilowatt hours, which translates to a percentage of energy savings of 365%, which is great. The annual emission reduction, more specifically here, is 727 kilograms CO2e. And this is a percentage of emission reduction of 81.22. So here, if we have an emission reduction threshold of about 40, let's say, this easily meets that threshold. If this was a different threshold, if this was 90, this would change color to red because it indicates that the percentage of emission reduction hasn't met the threshold. And so this threshold number really would influence whether or not this would be colored green or colored red, because it gives you an indication of how much of the emissions are being saved. Now, if I also indicated here that the project lifetime is a 10-year project lifetime, the equipment is meant to last for 10 years. So that's giving an indication that the total emission reduction of the project lifetime would be quite significant at 7.2 tons of CO2e over a lifetime of 10 years. So that's an example using the energy efficiency module. What I might do is go through another example, perhaps a little bit more complex. And here we would be looking more specifically at farming. So as with the energy as with the energy efficiency module, when we're looking at the farming module, we'll note that there are 6 panels here, albeit, as you can see, much more complicated because there are more inputs and there are more measures that need to be done in order to assess this. So here we've got our 6 panels, so project information, baseline data, and new installation data, or in this case, new farming data. And then we have our farming module results, baseline emissions, and new emissions. Now, if I go through this example, here we're looking at a series of farming improvements, all of which are part of a single project. So here I've indicated what those specific farming improvements are. We have the substitution of tractor diesel fuels with liquefied petroleum gas. We have increasing solar panel installation by 15%, diverting 150 kilograms of general waste to organic waste, as well as replacing synthetic fertilizers with composting. Now, if I say that we've put in a date, in this case, I'm the assessor, and we've left that the emission reduction threshold here is 20%. Now, when I've been entering these values, specifically for the baseline data, we look at the farm general information, and this is really just to understand, okay, what is the crop type? The crop type here is not particularly important, but this is just to give an indication more specifically of if this is a particular project focusing on one type of farm, then this will be done for one particular type of farm project. And so here we've selected that the crop type is buckwheat, annual harvested yield is 225 kilograms, and the farm area of the crop type is 32 hectares. Now, as you can see, this doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on any baseline emission outputs. However, as I mentioned, it's more or less a bit of project information or just general information on the farm that you're dealing with. Now, when we're looking at electricity, we also look at annual grid electricity consumption and annual renewable electricity consumption. So as we can see, this is a farm that already has renewable electricity consumption on it, but they have a significant amount of grid electricity consumption as well on an annual basis. And what that does is it also results in an output of what those power consumptions translate to emissions-wise. And so, as you can see, with renewable electricity, there's no emissions, but with baseline grid electricity, there are emissions that translate to 9.56 kilograms CO2e. Moving forward, with the fuel consumption, we're looking at up to we can list up to 5 fuel types here and the annual consumption to operate the farm for the specified crop. So here we've specified that the default fuel here is gas oil or diesel oil. And this is a baseline annual fuel consumption of 250 liters of this fuel. Now, we indicate that there is a substitution of tractor diesel fuels with liquefied petroleum gas. And so what we try to do here is indicating that the tractor diesel fuels consume 250 liters of annual fuel a year. Now, this also, again, translates into outputs in this column. And as you can see, the baseline fuel emissions come to about 677 kilograms CO2e. Similarly, we have waste and wastewater. As we mentioned earlier in the project, we are diverting 150 kilograms of general waste to organic waste. And so when we're talking about the diversions, this is the baseline waste generation, so annual organic waste of 125 kilograms a year, and that is in composting. And then general waste is 250 kilograms a year, and that's in landfill. And this also provides an indication of what those emissions are. One thing I want to highlight here is you'll notice that the organic waste emission factor is 10, general waste emission factor is 458. So there's clearly a difference in emission reduction through the diversion of waste, specifically for this farm. And then when we're looking at pesticides, we put in a pesticide amount here, should we want to. In this case, pesticide is not a part of this study. However, in this case study, we've looked at fertilizers. And so we've looked at phosphoric acid and NPK with annual fertilizer amounts of 24 and 15 respectively. And this also translates into emissions again in the baseline emissions output column on the right. Now, stepping through into the new farming data, this is where we start entering the updates to what these specific farm improvements all culminate in. And so here we've got the annual projected harvested yield. It still all stays the same. But now we have that the annual renewable electricity consumption has gone up to 2.3 kilowatt hours. And so because we've increased the renewable electricity consumption because of the 15% increase in solar panels, this has resulted in emissions of 20.19 kilograms CO2e. When we're looking at the fuel consumption here for the tractors, 250 liters of the LPG, this has replaced the diesel, and so this has gone down to 384.54 kilograms of CO2e. Then we're looking at what's happening with the waste and wastewater. We've noted that there was a diversion of waste from the landfill and the composting. So landfill is now going to combustion. There is more waste going into composting as well. And so this is captured here in this emissions at 77.95 as well as 2.3. And then moving on to fertilizer, we notice that there's now compost fertilizer that's being used instead of the original phosphoric acid and NPK fertilizers. And these translate into emissions here of 484.99. Now, when we go back up and we look at our farming module results, we note here that there are energy savings that are quite significant at 835.81 kilowatt hours, annual emission reduction of 360. What we also have here is an additional measure with the emission reductions per harvested yield. So this is based again on the general information, and we see that there's 1,600 kilograms of CO2e per ton of harvested yield. So it's basically saying that based on the output of this specific farm, we've seen significant savings. And the most important ones here are the percentage of emission reduction and generally the percentage of emission reduction per harvested yield, assuming the harvested yield doesn't change in the baseline scenario and the new scenario remain the same. But 42.61% is the reduction, and that easily meets the project emission reduction threshold. And again, we have our project lifetime option, as well as the emission reduction over the project lifetime, which is a very simple calculation, but we enter the project lifetime here in the new farming data, projected lifetime of new practices. So this is basically just an overview of the way that the tool works. Specifically, we've gone through the energy efficiency module and the farming module. Each of the different modules are tailored specifically for the type of scenario. So with transportation, for example, you're looking more at distance travel and fuel efficiency. For buildings, you're looking more specifically at building materials, as well as construction energy, as well as the transportation of the building materials. For waste, here we're looking more specifically at waste management, the waste generation and the transportation of waste. Fuel conversion, this is where we're looking at just the replacement of fuels or with different energy sources. And in the water module here, we've started looking more at the energy consumption during water supply and treatment and what changes are being done in terms of energy consumption or energy efficiency within the water supply and water treatment spaces. So that concludes my presentation. So I'm happy to help lead the next part of this discussion where we can have an open discussion about the tool. So thanks everyone for your time.
Thanks, Ajit. Thank you so much for this. We will now proceed to the open discussion. And if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or ask them in the Q&A box. I see that one of the questions has already been responded to in the Q&A box. And the question was, is the tool publicly available and does it require any customization for each country? So just for everybody's convenience, the tool currently is not publicly available. However, as part of the Asia-Let's partnership, we can provide this tool on a need and a basis or on request from countries or from banks that look forward to using this tool. So that's one of the questions. And if we do have any, Stephanie, would you like to add on to what Ajit has mentioned in the tool, or shall we wait for the questions to come in?
I think it's best to wait for more questions to come in.
Okay. we do have a few questions which we
Hmm.
have currently. For the South Pole team, as you know that we have covered 8 modules
Mhm.
in this tool, but from an objective manner, would you say that it's a holistic approach to using for loan approval systems, or would you like to maybe add on at a later stage to this tool?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. Generally speaking, this is a very holistic tool. And I think I mentioned that there are limitations to this tool. It's very specifically made for, the case in Mongolia. I think TDB did mention that, getting baseline data for the Mongolian context was difficult. And so we did rely upon a lot of IPCC cases and IPCC emission factors in places where we didn't have country-specific data. What I would also say, and I think this probably tags onto the previous question, Pratibha, about, do country-specific modifications need to occur when making a tool like this? Short answer is yes, for sure. They should occur. But obviously different countries have a different level of baseline data that they can collect in order to develop this type of tool. At South Pole, we can develop more detailed tools. However, it should be noted that the level of detail of these tools, instead of taking a less holistic approach, having a more specific project-based approach is highly, highly dependent on the type of baseline data we can get. So that is really what feeds into the development of these tools. And so with this particular tool, it does take a very holistic approach. It's a very high level approach. We've done our best to base it upon what sort of data the Mongolian banks had available and what sort of data they generally can get from clients. And in places where we haven't been able to get the baseline data, we've made assumptions and extrapolations that are in line with best practice. So when we're talking about best practice, we generally are talking about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And that is really looking at, okay, are we being consistent? Are we being transparent? Are we being as accurate as possible? And making sure that it's in line with international best practice guidelines as determined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. And so would you say then, is it easy to upgrade and to update the information based on, like, now that this is set for different countries, would it be easier for them to update as and when the efficiency improves, the technology improves?
Yeah, look, it really depends on what the countries are looking for, right? So I think it's definitely easier to update because you have something to work with, right? So if we're talking about this specific interface, assuming that this specific interface is something that can be made public, which in this case, obviously it can't, but should it be one of those things where it's easy to kind of replicate and make public, then yes, short answer is it's slightly easier. However, I do want to highlight that different countries will have different needs and different wants on what sort of modules they may want to cover. And so that can have an impact on, how easy it is to really upgrade the tool to fit that purpose.
Thanks. So carrying on from this, maybe a few questions for the Trade and Development Bank. A simple question is, how effective has it been and how has it been useful for you to use this tool? And has it been easy for you to adapt, moving from what you had as a loan approval process initially? In using this tool, has it been easy for you to take on this tool and adapt? I'm not sure I can hear from the team. I can see that you've unmuted.
Oh, sorry, we were muted.
No problem.
Sorry, could you repeat the first question?
So moving from what you currently used to do for green loans, is it been easy for you to adapt using this tool, and was it useful for you, and was it convenient for you to use this tool to assess the loan process?
Okay. Okay, thank you. We would definitely say that it has made our assessment steps much easier compared to before. And in terms of adaptation, because we took part in the development stage of the tool, I think it was relatively easier for us to understand what our colleague from South Pole, Edrit, just showed us. So I would say it hasn't been very difficult, but as you know, a lot of the cases that's coming in for us, they usually ask if their line of work or line of business is suitable for sustainable finance. So they provide us with many different data, and we have to always choose what would be more applicable to use it through our ER assessment tool. So I would say that maybe the difficulty part of it is to have like a holistic understanding on what exactly is a green project and what are you going to finance. So that was the only difficulty we faced. But in terms of the adaptation, I would say it was relatively easy thanks to the tool itself. Thank you.
Thanks. And do you consider this tool as being a holistic one, or would you like to add on to several more modules to this tool going forward?
We would say that because, as I've mentioned before, it's a case-by-case learning process for us as well to use the tool. There would be probably even more tailored ER tool that we would discuss with our ALP and South Pole team in the future. So, as I mentioned before, again, the sustainable finance field is a relatively new thing to the banking system here. So that's why I think it will take some time for us to exactly define what we need to add into our current ER tool, like an additional component. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. I do have one more question for you, but before that, I think there's a question in the Q&A box. So the question is, does the tool also have seasonal emission rates? Since farming is covered in the assessment, how has the tool accommodated seasonal changes which might have an impact on the GHG profile pertaining to a particular project or activity? Maybe Ajit or Stephanie, would you like to take this? Yeah.
Sure. So the tool doesn't include seasonal emission rates. And I think this actually pertains a little bit to what the TDB team has just talked about, which is one thing that this tool will always ask the question for your clients is, you know, how would you define a green project? And how would you therefore be able to kind of use the tool to implement an understanding of what the potential emission reductions are. So one thing I want to highlight, particularly with the farming module that we went through, is you'll note that we specifically looked at farming improvements that are not necessarily related specifically to seasonal changes. So if we're talking about, let's say, tractor diesel, the consumption of tractor diesel, or the installation of a solar panel, or the diversion of general waste to organic waste. A lot of these are not necessarily, I mean, there are some seasonal effects, but they're going to be relatively minor compared to, let's say, what is going to be the yield of a particular farm, right? And so if we're talking about, let's say, increasing solar panel installation, we still have the option of saying, okay, your installed capacity of solar panels has increased, but maybe your generation is lower for whatever given year because there just hasn't been enough solar radiance in order to actually calculate the amount of power that a farm would need to run. And so in that sense, it captures the seasonal effects on a very absolute level, but not on it doesn't really model those seasonal effects more specifically. And so that is something that is not easy to implement in a tool like this, because really what this tool does or aims to answer are very high level absolute emission reductions that can occur in any given year.
Okay, thanks. Hayden, if you do have further questions on this, you can ask in the chat box again. There's another question on how is the government support in reduction program. I think I can hand this over to TDB to share the relationship between the Ministry of Environment and Tourism and the Green Loan Program. Yes.
In terms of the government support, since 2013, Mongolia started to implement a lot of documents and policies on sustainable finance, especially in terms of the banking system. So I would say we got this tool with the help from the Ministry of Tourism and Environment. And also we have a local association called Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association, which is in charge of implementing this policy into the banking system as well. So I would say we work closely with them because we also need another guidance and policies since it's a financial sector. So I would say we do work closely with them, and we would not be able to receive this kind of help if it wasn't for them.
Great, yes. And lastly, to the TDB Bank, what would be the two key messages that you would like to give to banks across Asia who would like to take up this initiative for developing this tool? Any key points?
So first of all, I'd say that it would mostly depend on the country where you would like to develop this tool. For example, for Mongolia, as we have mentioned before during our presentation, it was quite difficult for us to collect all the baseline data in order to develop this tool. So across the country, there are various data and various implementation projects, whether so it depends whether your data on some sectors they're available currently, or it would take some time for the government and also for other stakeholders, other organizations to collect those data. So first of all, you would need to define your core sectors, areas where you would like to implement this tool.
And second of all, I would say every country has a different journey to implementing policies and guidelines in terms of sustainable finance. So it's very, as this was like one of the key points that we mentioned before, it's a case-by-case learning process. So there would be a lot of uncertainties, and where you also need help from the expertise. And that's why I think South Pole came in at the right time to help us in terms of our green loan assessment, because I would say the assessment process in general is very subjective. It can, even brown projects sometimes can be overlooked as green ones. So we do really need specific tools to assess these projects that are coming in for your green loans. So I would say, as a last point, that it's a case-by-case learning process. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Ajit, any message, any considerations for future banks that would like to look at this work? Anything that they should keep in mind moving forward?
Yeah, I think when we talk about, I think definitely the baseline data part is a really important point, because obviously that influences how useful or accurate a tool can be. Keeping in mind that when it comes to emission reductions, it's all relative, you know, so, you know, the reason we were able to utilize international values quite readily for this type of application is because you would expect reductions in emissions not to change significantly from, let's say, switching fuel sources in any part of the world, right? So I would definitely say keeping an eye on baseline data, and that would mean for banks particularly, keeping on track of what your government is doing in terms of collecting this sort of information, knowing where to collect this information. It should come primarily through government, but even if it's through universities, even if it's through industry bodies, it's definitely useful to have an understanding of what sort of data is out there within your own country. Another thing I would also encourage banks who want to undertake this sort of process is if they're already undertaking kind of green loan assessments under different schemes like the GCF or other sort of bodies, is how those processes or what those processes kind of ask for from your potential clients. So, what sort of data are you already asking for from your clients? Because that will actually help influence, okay, what sort of inputs would this tool require? And what sort of inputs can we actually get? I think in our conversations with ALP, TDBM, and MSFA, what our learning a lot of the time from the South Pole side was getting an understanding of what TDBM was asking its clients, or what it needed to ask its clients in order to actually assess the project, and it definitely made it easy for us to understand, okay, with TDBM, they could tell us, okay, our clients generally don't have this type of data, or we've generally not asked our clients for this type of data, but maybe we can start asking for this type of data if it's available. So those are kind of the two things, understanding what sort of baseline data you have in your country from different bodies and the government, and also being able to understand what sort of data you're already requesting from your clients in the space of green loans.
Great, thank you so much. I think if there are no further questions from the audience, we can move on to the closing session. If we don't have any further questions, I'll just wait for a few minutes just to ensure that we participants have any questions. They can raise their hands if they would like to directly ask a question. No, I don't think so at the moment. So I think we'll move on to the closing session. Ritvik, if possible, can you put the slides up? Okay, sorry. There is one question that we have now. So this is, what will be the emission reduction factor for any renewable energy projects, floating solar or ground mounted solar for small projects, 1 to 2 megawatts, any particular method or code or region-wise data which needs to follow? Ajit, would you like to take it up?
Yep, sure. So when we're talking about the emission reduction factor for any renewable energy project, I think the thing is, it really just depends on what sort of, let's say, and I think this again goes back to baseline data. So if we have an understanding of what, let's say, the emission factors are for floating solar or ground mounted solar for small scale projects, this is the type of situation where we would request initially, okay, what sort of baseline data do you have within your country when it comes to these sorts of renewable energy projects? So that would be the first question. Within our kind of version of the tool, we took a lot of our emission reduction factors specifically from the IPCC. So it was usually kind of based on very basic types of solar projects. So photovoltaic or like thermal solar power, large scale thermal solar power. Those are the sorts of kind of default project emission factors you have when it comes to understanding the emission reductions. Now, in the cases where you've got, let's say, floating solar or ground mounted solar, and you're just assuming that these are going to be zero emissions, and really the only emissions would come from, let's say, the transmission and distribution losses from renewable energy projects, those are really the only emission reduction or emission factors you would need to focus on, assuming floating solar and ground-mounted solar are just 100% renewable. But really, when we're looking at an emission reduction factor, it's not really an emission reduction factor, it's an emission factor based on the differences between, okay, what's the emission factor for a scenario where you're using grid electricity versus what is the emission factor for a project where you're using floating solar or ground mounted, and then looking at the difference.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, before we move further, we would like to take a group picture. As you know, we would really love to have had everybody in person. To have this, unfortunately, we live in a time where we have to do it virtually. So if everybody can put on their cameras, we'd just like to take a group picture. Will it be possible for Ajit and Stephanie as well?
Mine's not letting me for some reason.
Okay. Okay, no problem. I'll just ask my colleagues to just take the picture with us currently. Okay, I'll just say 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think Anand is also trying. Okay, no problem. He's got, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just say 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Thank you so much. So as we come to the closing of the session, I would like to thank the Trade and Development Bank of Mongolia for being such supportive partners in this, and also contributing so much information and so much time in helping in developing this tool. It has been a pleasure to be working with you. I would also like to thank the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, who initially came to us with this request, and we were more than willing to help in this endeavor, and for them to even have the faith and the trust that the Asia-Let's partnership, along with the South Pole, could provide this support to them. And lastly, I would like to thank the South Pole team, who have been working tirelessly for over a year to support the Trade and Development Bank in developing this extremely holistic tool, which has been greatly useful to them. And we look forward to developing and supporting many more countries who come to us for such activities. I would also like to thank the participants today for joining into this session, and for all your questions and your active participation. We look forward to having your feedback on the webinar, as well as any support that we can provide and any questions that we can answer about the tool as part of the post-webinar survey, which will pop up on your screens after the webinar ends. The presentation and the recordings will also be shared with everybody via via email, as well as the recording will also be available on our YouTube channel, which is called Asia-Let's Partnership. And you'll also see other sessions that we have conducted on this channel. Please do share it among your colleagues and peers, as they've been quite valuable sessions, and we can always help you further with some technical assistance that the countries require. If you do have any kind of information or the country priorities that need to be supported, the Asia-Let's Partnership, along with the Let's Global Partnership, is available to help. So kindly do write to us at Asia-Let's partnership.icli.org. We will share this email ID with you in the chat box as well. So thank you everybody for joining in today, and we look forward to having you in further sessions in the future. Thank you from colleagues from the Trade and Development Bank, and thanks colleagues from the South Pole team as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.